The following is an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Hello, welcome to Art Glass Today. In a previous episode, we've learned how to put together projects using what we traditionally call the Tiffany method, which means we wrap the glass with copper foil and then solder over it. So we made a small window as well as a small lamp using that process. Today, I would like to show you how to work with lead cane. Lead cane has been used for hundreds of years. When you think about all the large cathedral windows, those are all made out of lead cane. Lead cane comes in two different shapes. The first shape is called H-lead, and H-lead is truly the shape of H on its side, so the glass can fit into the channel from one side and the other. H-lead comes in many different widths, so we can go anywhere from 3/4, or I've actually seen 1-inch lead, came all the way down to just a little over 1/8 of an inch. All the lead has what's called a heart in the center, and that is what separates all the pieces of glass. So generally speaking, no matter which width the leaf is, which is the part that covers the glass, the heart is all generally fairly consistent. So whether you're using the large ones or the small ones, you're going to cut the glass pretty much in the same dimension. The other type of lead is called U-lead. U-lead is pretty much only used for smaller projects as a border material. So if you're making a small sun catcher, you've decided to make it out of lead, you would use the lead cane for a border piece. Also, when we made our Tiffany style window earlier, we used the lead cane, the U channel, as a border because it's easy to bend and it's very nice to work with. I'm not going to be using this today, but you can also get H channels in brass, copper, and zinc. It's used in exactly the same way as what I'm going to show you today with the lead. However, it doesn't bend very well and it's very rigid. So if you need something that'll stand up to a fair amount of abuse, as an example, a lot of people have French doors, which are made out of the zinc or the brass. That's a really good use for it. But generally speaking, in church windows and in a window you'd make for your home, you'd use the lead cane because you want to have the opportunity to be able to bend the lead if necessary. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the tools that we are going to use. First of all, lead itself is a mixture of lead, antimony, and a couple of other materials that actually make the lead fairly stiff. In the early 1900s, when smelting processes became very sophisticated, they started using pure lead. And they found that the pure lead deteriorated much faster than lead that had some impurities in it. So these days we get our lead with specifically antimony put into it to stiffen it. This will help to add to the life expectancy of the lead, plus it makes the whole window a little stiffer so that it's less likely to bow at the bottom. To cut the lead, traditionally people use a lead knife. A lead knife often has a lead end on it, so you can use that to tap the glass into place, as well as a cutting edge which you have to sharpen fairly frequently with a sharpening stone. The way you would use this is you put it on a hard surface and then you rock back and forth until you make your way through the lead. Now, as you can see, it takes a fair amount of passes to make a cut on the lead. I find this very tiring for my wrist, so I personally do not use a lead knife very frequently. I prefer to use what are called lead nippers. And lead nippers, first of all, you can cut the lead off of the table, which is a real benefit, and you can cut at any different kind of an angle you want to. So if you want to make a clean cut, you take the flat side of the nippers and you can cut a nice clean edge. If I want to get a 45-degree angle on the lead, I will do the opposite. I'll have the two curved sides that I want to use on the good side of the lead, and as you can see, it cuts it to roughly a 45-degree angle, which can be useful when you're doing corners, etc. I'll show you that when we start putting together this piece. The other advantage of these pliers is I'll just cut it straight again, but you can also use it to cut quite sharp angles. So often you have to do one cut and then a second cut And if you want to make it even sharper still, we can cut out the heart of the lead. Remove it, and then I can cut a very sharp angle on here. Again, using these lead nippers. So I would highly recommend the lead nippers as the best way to go when you go to cutting the lead. It's pretty well impossible to get the lead cane even from the box to our work tables without having it either bend, kink, or sometimes if you're taking it home, people will actually make it into large rolls. So by the time you get it home, you need to stretch it before you can use it. Stretching it does two things. It gets it straight again, and also it opens the pores of the lead so that later on when we're soldering it, it'll be easier for the solder to actually adhere to the lead. So what we need is a lead vise, which is very similar to a boat clamp. So if you've used a boat clamp, you'll know that when you push the rope into it, it's very hard to pull it out. And same thing with a lead vise. You put one end of the lead into the lead vise. You then walk to the other end. You take a pair of pliers. In our case, we use Grosier pliers because they're handy. And then you will stretch the lead. Usually you'll get about 2 inches out of a piece of 1/4 inch lead. So you give it a good tug so you can actually pull it and get it nice and straight and get it ready for soldering later on. Later on, when we start assembling our piece, and you can see this one is partially assembled, we need to use nails to hold everything in place. Traditionally, people used horseshoe nails, and the advantage of a horseshoe nail is that it is flat on both sides. So by being flat, when you put it up against the glass, it's unlikely to chip the glass. You don't put it on super tight, so it's unlikely to chip the glass because the edge is flat. Personally, I tend to like to use just a regular flat-headed nail. And if you are using the nail, though, because it's round, you need to put a small piece of lead between the glass piece and the nail to hold it in place. Other than that, you're going to need a hammer. The smaller the better. There's really no value in having a huge hammer. Just enough to give you some good leverage. And as far as safety goes, we are working with a lead material. So the lead is not something you want to ingest into your body. So as far as safety concerns, make sure that you're not eating at the same time that you're working with lead. Make sure that you're not smoking a cigarette if you have that habit while you're working. And do your best not to touch your mucous membranes or anywhere else where you could be transferring the lead into your body. Once you've finished, you could wear gloves. It's not a bad idea if you are the kind of person that is happy, can feel comfortable using latex gloves. By all means, that's not a bad idea. However, if you don't wear gloves, there are different soaps that can be purchased that will help to get the heavy metals out of your skin. As you can imagine, people that are doing mining processes have a lot of different metals that they're touching on an ongoing basis. So this particular one is called D-lead. It's actually meant for the stained glass industry. And it will get all the lead out of your hands after you finish working if you use it vigorously. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to take a minute, I'm going to clear off my workspace, and I'll show you how to put together a lead cane stained glass window. What I'd like to do now is show you the pattern that I'm going to be using and show you the process of putting together a window using lead cane. First of all, I'd like to bring your attention to the fact that I have 2 lines on the outside of my pattern here. The first pencil line on the outside tells me what size I want the window to be when it's finished. The second line tells me what size I need to cut the glass to make that happen. Now, the reason there's 2 different sizes there is because the lead that I'm going to use on the border is an H lead. It has a hollow on both sides. The glass is only going to fit into one side. There will not be any glass on the second side, but it's going to provide a cushion for the glass to sit down on, as well as it gives me the opportunity, if I have to later on, to shave this down to make it fit into a frame that might be slightly off square or maybe slightly smaller than I thought, or the window is too big for the opening. So that's why we have the 2 lines there. The line that we have on here is a little wider than we use for a copper foil project because the heart of the lead does need some space for everything to fit together properly. So once I got the pattern where I want it, I tape it down onto a board. You usually want to use either a 1/2 inch or a 3/4 inch piece of plywood. You need something that's very flat. And generally I would do this on a table that's made out of 3/4 inch plywood so that it's not bouncing around when I'm hammering the nails in. In this case, I put boards along 2 sides, and the boards were hammered right along this pencil line because, again, that's the size I want it to be when I'm finished. I've put the H-lead around 2 sides for the border, and I've started to assemble this corner of the panel. You always start in a corner, whether it's, and it's always the one that's closest to you. So personally, I like to work from my right hand into a left-hand corner. If you happen to be left-handed, you'll probably prefer to do the opposite. But I find it works really well for me to start with one corner and work my way into there. So first of all, I put in this piece, cut this little piece of lead, and then slip this piece in. Then I put this piece in. And note that I used a slightly wider lead here. I want to give a little variation, at least, in the leads that I'm using. And then I moved forward here. So as you can see, I put these 2 nails in here to hold everything in place. And the reason I like these large-headed nails, as I mentioned, is I can just use my hammer now and pull these out. So I want to, with my left hand, make sure that this doesn't move around. With my right hand, I can take a piece, I can test it in here, and I like to use these little pieces to actually go on top of here and mark where I have to cut the lead so that it'll fit properly. So I can just take a nail, I can make a mark on this long piece of lead where I want to cut it. So that later on when I put this piece of lead on there, actually I'm going to be using the wider one, so I should be using a small piece of the wider lead. I'll mark that. And now I can pick this up, and with these lead nips, I can actually do it right off the table. Cut it, slip that one in. So you can see later on when I cut a piece of lead to fit on the top, it's going to fit nice and tight. I can then take another one of my bevels. I'm using 3 kinds of glass here. I've got what's called a cord glass, which I'm going to use for the border. It has a nice kind of a ripply texture to it. And I then have a piece of what's called Flemish glass that is going to go beside that. And then I've got the bevels to go in the center. Notice that we have actually labeled all of the pieces for this project. Even though it may look to you as if this piece and this piece are the same, they're not. So it's good to label them so that when you go to put it together, the pieces that you've cut go back to the right homes. So I take my glass, I slip it into the channel. So this is actually going partway into the lead, and I slip it down into this bottom piece of lead. And if all is going well, you should be able to see the lead line, or pardon me, the felt pen line all the way around your piece. In this case, it's working out really well. So now I'm going to take another piece of lead, cut off a nice clean edge. Slip it against here. Take a small piece of sample lead, mark where I need to cut this so it'll have a reasonably tight fit. Now I can take my bevel, do the same thing. So it's important now to keep this in place while I'm working on the top part. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to finish off these top pieces and put this one in last. So I want to put my little piece of lead there, my nail against it. Same thing here. Okay, now as I mentioned, I'm using a slightly wider lead for this line and this line. So I will get a nice clean edge on this one. Line it up. Doesn't necessarily have to fit right into the glass at this point, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Take my piece of lead that I'm going to use along the edge there, make my mark, pull it out, cut it. You want your pieces of lead to fit tightly, but when we go to solder, there is a little bit of flexibility on it. So if there's a little bit of a gap, that's better than making it too tight. If you try and cut the glass or the lead too tight, what happens is sooner or later you find that the glass is actually not being embedded into the lead properly. If everything is slightly too big, then there's spaces and it's a very loose fitting window. It's a lot better if you can get your lead very, very slightly small, so there's a very small space, and then when you solder over it, of course, all those voids get filled. So I've got that one. Now I have to get the corner one in. Now, as I mentioned, the lead dikes or nippers will cut a 45-degree angle. And that comes in very handy for the corners, because when I put this piece in here, that 45-degree angle is going to give me a nice tight fit there, a tight fit along the edge, and then when I put the top piece on, again, a nice tight fit. So there is a lot of advantages in using the lead dikes to give me that nice 45-degree edge. So now what I want to do is I'm going to go along and cut a piece of lead for this piece. Take my little piece, make a mark. I've now got all the lead came assembled on my project. As I mentioned, we've got the H-lead on the border. Because I've got lead on the border, I don't have to worry about putting the little pieces of lead to keep the nails from chipping the glass, because of course there's a piece of lead there. So I just put the nails right against the lead. I could put two boards along the outside here for these other two sides, but in a small project like this, the nails are more than adequate. So the next step is to solder this together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my soldering equipment, get it plugged in, and we'll come back and show you how to solder together a lead cane panel. Once you have your piece all assembled, now it's time to start soldering it together. I would use 60-40 solder. I find that that works really well. Solid core solder, if you're not familiar with soldering stained glass pieces, you don't want to get anything that is rosin core. That is meant for electrical work. You want to have solid core solder. And I am going to be using a non-acid liquid flux. You do not want to be buying flux that has got zinc chloride in it. It's not going to be good for your health in the long run. So this is a non-acid flux. It's also a water-soluble flux, so later on it's very easy to wash it off. So what I'll do is I'll pour a little bit of flux into the top of the lid, and I will put this as far away from me as possible, because generally speaking, it always gets knocked all over the table and ruins your pattern. So put it aside. Better still, if you've got a separate container for your flux, you can put the lid back on. I like to use a flux brush to apply the flux to the piece. And I wouldn't do the whole thing at once. Generally with the liquid fluxes, it's better to do a small area and then add more flux, do a small area, add more flux, etc. I like to use an iron that has a temperature control on it. So this particular iron by Hakko gives me the opportunity to have many different varieties of temperatures for different purposes. When you're working with lead cane, generally speaking, you want to be at a little cooler temperature than you are when you're working with copper foil work. The lead will melt, so if you are too high a temperature, that is an issue. So this allows me to start off, I'm going to start off at roughly 410 here. If that's too hot, if I find that I'm melting the lead, I'll turn it down. But that's usually a good place to start. Now keep in mind, if your tip is not properly tinned, it doesn't matter what temperature your iron is at, it's not going to work properly. So the way to keep your iron properly tinned is to first of all use an abrasive pad, which are available at stained glass shops, to take off any of the impurities on your soldering iron. And I always like to wipe it at least 3 or 4 times before I start to use it. You can see how nice and shiny that is now. If by any chance you leave your soldering iron on overnight, which inevitably happens to everybody, then you have to retin it. You have to put a little more effort into it. So to do that, you have to take some steel wool while it's hot, clean off as much of the dross, etc., that's on there as possible, and then wipe it in a mixture of 60-40 solder and flux. But if all goes well and you don't do that, you'll find that using the abrasive pad is all you'll ever have to do. What I like to do now is I'm going to do a few of these solder seams. Because I've got the nails all the way around, everything is held in place firmly. So I don't have to use 2 hands to hold anything in place. So I'm just going to do the bottom part here first. So I flux those. I got my 60-40 solder, which I will then put on top of the lead, right at the joint, and now I'm just going to have to melt this and hold the iron on there long enough so that the solder is actually getting a chance to bond with the lead. If you go too quickly and the lead itself is not properly heated up, the solder does not actually bond. It just kind of falls on top of the lead, and it's not an integral part of it. If all goes well, we're actually ending up with a completely different material. We've got the lead, we've got the solder, and then we've got the third material, which is the lead, which is impregnated with the solder. So as you can see, that there is a little bit of smoke that's coming up off of the flux. And this is something you don't want to be inhaling. So I would suggest that you either have a fan blowing it away from you while you're soldering. Better still, if you go down to a stained glass shop, they will sell different fume absorbers, which actually bring this through a carbon filter so that, again, you're not inhaling any of the fumes. Or you can actually put it together a hose which comes down here and it extracts it right out of your workshop, which of course in the long run is probably your best bet. So the only thing I need to do now is I want to make sure if there is any slack, and these are really fitting together tightly, I want to make sure that everything's lined up. I want this cross to be an actual cross. I don't want it to be have one of the lead pieces slightly out of alignment. So if you have an opportunity, give it a check. If everything's nice and tight like this one is, then you just keep moving on. So once I've got the one side soldered, I can then pull out my nails on the border. As you can see, I've got lead sticking out on 3 of my corners, so I can very simply take my lead nippers, cut them off flush, And at this point, I'm going to flip the panel over and do exactly the same thing, soldering the back. Okay, so now I've got both sides soldered, the front and the back. And I want to point out something. If I tap this, you can hear that some of the glass is loose in here. Now, traditionally, stained glass windows did not have a storm window on them. If you go to Europe, a lot of the old cathedrals still only have one layer of glass, which is the stained glass. So it was very important to waterproof those windows. The way they waterproofed them is they took a material which we call cement, but in reality it's a putty. And we push the putty between the glass pieces and the lead came. What the putty does is it hardens actually, so that it does add some rigidity and some strength to the piece, but it also keeps it watertight and keeps things from rattling. In today's society, the watertightness is really not an issue because we always have a sealed unit or some kind of an operating unit on the outside of the stained glass window. However, we have things like buses going past which are going to cause rattling, etc. So it's really important to do the cementing to add some rigidity and to keep them from rattling. The next step after we use the cement to go between the two materials, the glass and the lead, is to take what's called whiting. It's a calcium carbonate product, and we use that to absorb all the extra cement that's been put on, because when we do the cementing, it's very messy. It absorbs all that and it helps us to clean the glass up. So after that, we'll take pointing sticks, we go around all the lead, we make sure that we've gotten all the excess cement off of the piece. We will then let it sit for a couple of days, and then we'll buff it up with a dry cloth to get a really nice shine to the lead, and also to get any residual cement, etc., off the glass itself. So I really think that working with lead came is a wonderful way of making pieces that have a lot of straight lines. Where you ever want to doing something for a building that's of historical nature and you know that it's going to be there for hundreds of years, it's a wonderful way to go about it. And if you're really a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright especially, pretty well all of his windows were made with either lead came or a very thin brass material or zinc material. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I really enjoy working with lead myself, and I find that it's very satisfying. And it's well worth considering making a piece out of lead came just to learn the process.
The proceeding was an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.